You can introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, I'm Heather Driscoll, and I'm running for Assembly District 76. I've been on the east side of Madison for about 8 years and have 2 kids and a husband and 2 kids that are currently in the public school system. And I decided to run because I've been working on several different issues in the community around environmental issues with climate change and water issues, as well as gun violence prevention and advocating for access to healthcare for everybody. So those are a few of the issues that are really important to me, but there's many progressive issues that I'd like to focus on at the state level. And I have experience working within the Capitol on gun violence prevention, meeting with legislators and organizing advocacy days, and have also spent 6 months in Representative Taylor's office working on the Wisconsin Coalition for Gun Safety. So that's an area that I see a major need for progress in is common sense gun reform. And with climate change, it's such an urgent issue that I really believe it's necessary to have a champion pushing for quick action and committing to 100% renewable energy by 2030. So I worked with the school district, the MMSD school district, on passing the 100% renewable energy resolution last year, and would continue pushing for renewable energy at the state level, as well as clean water is another big issue of having access to clean drinking water, and the phosphorus in the lakes that we are seeing right now. We've already had several closures, to beaches here in Madison, and there's some things that we can do on legislation to make that better as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Peter German. I'm the co-chair of the Dane County chapter of Our Wisconsin Revolution. Thank you so much for being here. Aisha, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Aisha Mo. I'm on the OWR Dane County Steering Committee. Heather, I'm going to start with the first question. Do you support publicly funded elections? Why or why not?
Yes, I do support publicly funded elections. I think that, I've been a long supporter actually since I was in college, which was 20 years ago. I really strongly supported campaign finance reform. I think it's something that people shouldn't only be able to run for office if they have money to do so. And I strongly believe that elections shouldn't be funded by special interests, especially corporate interests and the fossil fuel industry and the gun lobby, and so many interests that get involved with spending money on elections and make the elections unfair. So I absolutely would support publicly funding elections, and I think it's something that would be better for our state and our country, and much fairer, more equitable way of running elections.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you favor extending the time frame to vote at polls during elections to like a minimum of 2 weeks ahead of the election date?
Yeah, I do. I think that wherever we can make voting more accessible is a good thing. And I also think that right now in Wisconsin, our voter ID laws are restrictive and keep people from being able to exercise their right. And the fact that we don't have, that some people are working full-time and during election day, expanding those hours so people can vote when they're able to, is very positive, and I would support any sort of legislation to help expanding with voter access.
Awesome.
Thanks.
What model or plan do you prefer for redistricting?
I believe in having an independent, nonpartisan commission, similar to what's in Iowa for redistricting, where it shouldn't be where legislators are choosing their voters. Voters should be choosing their legislators. So I would absolutely support a new process where we would get rid of the gerrymandering and have a commission deciding on having accurate representation, so we don't end up in the situation where we had in 2018 with the election, where we had all the statewide candidates were elected Democrat, but we only gained 1 seat in the assembly for the Democratic majority, or in the Democratic minority, but only 1 seat shifted, even though there was such a huge turnout for Democrats in that election. So it was very clear, how much the gerrymandering has impacted people's ability to choose their elected officials.
Thank you very much. So in the emergence from this pandemic, or no, wait, skip one. So what would you describe as your top 3 legislative priorities, and what will you do to move them through the legislature?
Yeah, with what I talked about with the water issues, there's a lot of legislative priorities that I have that I think at this point in time politically are necessary to push forward for, but it's a very difficult political environment. An area where I think that there really could be improvement with some of the water issues where we could get bipartisan support is around increasing like soil health and cover crops to help with the phosphorus that's getting into our waterways. I could introduce legislation around that to also help with funding counties, incentivizing farmers so they can cover their crops and keep a lot of times the phosphorus that's in the soil. If you have just row crops without cover crops on them, that phosphorus can leak into the waterways and get down into the lakes, and we end up with situations with toxic environments with blue-green algae. So that's an area that could also help the lakes as well as drinking water, because a lot of the wells across the state have been contaminated with phosphorus and also nitrates. And then with lead, we've seen lead getting into water. And here in Madison, we were lucky that we had a mayor about 15 years ago who had the foresight to replace all the lead pipes in the city. But in other parts of the state, that's not the case. There are still areas where people's drinking water is getting poisoned by lead. So I would introduce legislation to do lead testing in daycares and in schools. And then another area is gun violence prevention. I've worked on pushing for background checks on every gun purchase, as well as extreme risk protection orders. And those 2 laws alone would save hundreds and hundreds of lives, because right now guns are just way too accessible for people who shouldn't have access to them and that are using them in situations where they are lawfully not supposed to be able to purchase them, but because of so many loopholes with gun purchases, they're able to have access. So yeah, I would work on the water issues and gun violence prevention. And there's also a lot around criminal justice reform that I would like to work on. Ban the box. Right now, state employees, they outlawed the ban the box for state, but not for employees across the board. And that's an area I think we could make progress in, and also decriminalizing marijuana and also decriminalizing drugs in general. I think that's a big shift that we should have to reduce incarceration by decriminalizing nonviolent offenses.
Thank you. Switching gears, in the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, would you support a state-level economic hardship payment? Do you support direct payments to residents? And describe the components that you think should be included in such a bill.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a lot that needs to be done. Right now we're just starting. There's so many people that have been filing for unemployment, and I think that I would 100% support some sort of economic hardship program. I don't know exactly at this point how it would work. I would have to listen to the stakeholders and have meetings to figure out exactly where the money should go and how to approach it. And so I would do that by reaching out to voters and stakeholders and having listening sessions before I would come up with legislation, because I think it's really important to talk to the people who are most impacted before coming up with a plan.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. And then sort of a similar thread to this, a lot of people have lost their housing owing directly to the COVID pandemic. This question is, how will you guarantee housing to citizens? How will you deal with the financial situation of the people facing eviction because of the pandemic, and what specific solutions would you propose?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm a strong believer of housing as a human right, and having a moratorium on evictions. But at some point, what will happen once the pandemic is over? If we're delaying people from being evicted, but I think we also need to invest state level money into making sure that people keep their housing. And so I would advocate for a relief package and for funding so people don't end up being evicted.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Will you fight for single-payer healthcare? Will you fight for a single-payer healthcare system at the state level? And do you support a federal single-payer healthcare system?
I do. I absolutely do. And for me, it's something that's really personal. I have had experience of not having health insurance after I was in the Peace Corps for 2 years, and when I got back, I got really sick with pneumonia, and it was a scary situation to be in, to be really sick and to need to go to the emergency room and not having health insurance. But in San Francisco, they had really great systems in place where I actually was able to get the healthcare I needed and didn't get saddled with a lot of debt. But I have a close aunt who had a different outcome. She didn't have health insurance, and she had had a miscarriage previously, and had gone to the emergency room and ended up with a really high emergency room bill. And then she had a second miscarriage, and it was a tubal pregnancy, and she didn't go to the emergency room, and she ended up hemorrhaging to death. And that was a completely preventable tragedy, where if she would have gone to the emergency room, she would have been taken care of and she would still be here today. And so for me, I think, nobody should have to be in that situation where they're making a life or death decision on whether or not they should go to seek healthcare. And especially, around racial disparities, there are so many people here in Wisconsin who end up in situations where the infant mortality rates are higher among Black infants. And there are several documented cases of people from the Black community going to the hospital and waiting in emergency rooms and not getting the care they need. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on our healthcare system. And for me, what I would like to see happen is, of course, I think a nationwide Medicare for all would be ideal, but at the state level, I would push for also expanding Badger Care. And in New York, they actually have a bill, a New York Health Act, where they are working on like a universal healthcare system in the state for everybody, and it would also include undocumented immigrants as well. And when they looked at the money, how much money it would cost, it would actually be doable, if everybody is invested in the system. Because right now there's so much excess money spent on CEO salaries and marketing. And there's a case where there's a hospital where there's 900 medical beds and there are 900 people who work in billing. And so when you have so much excess on all these other things, it's a lot of money that's tied up, where if that money wasn't being spent on that and employers didn't have to provide healthcare for everybody, they'd be able to hire more employees, and the people who work in the healthcare industry on billing would have other opportunities with businesses who wouldn't be having to pay for everybody's healthcare.
Thank you. Will you pass workers' rights laws helping those who are forced to return to work, but who risk infection from COVID-19? And absent the equivalent of a single-payer system, will you push the state to guarantee medical coverage through Badger Care for those who are affected in this way?
Yeah, definitely. I completely support that. And I think providing paid leave, paid sick leave is something that's really important. Nobody should be having to feel like they have to go to work sick because they can't afford not to because they have their bills to pay. So I would 100% support that.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, so this next question's a speed round. It's a series of questions and you just have to respond yes or no, okay? Will you support the end of broken windows policing?
Yes.
Do you support community oversight?
Yes.
Would you support the limiting of the use of force?
Yes.
By police?
Yes.
Do you support independent investigations and prosecution of police officers?
Yes.
Do you support greater community representation?
Yes.
Do you support increased body cams and filming of police?
Yes, but I don't know if I can answer around that, or do I just have to say yes or no?
You can provide like a little bit of justification.
Yeah, I want to say like increased surveillance. I know there's concerns about increased surveillance and that being used against people. So, and I'm also a little concerned about spending more money on policing. So that's an area that I think you'd have to look at carefully, because I believe that we should be able to document that. But at the same time, I think you're going to be asking me about defunding police too, because I think that's where the difficulty is. So.
Would you support increased training for police officers?
Yes, but that's the part where with the funding that I'm not quite sure how that would work. So, okay.
I have an opportunity to respond to that next. Would you be in support of ending for-profit policing?
Yes.
And are you in support of demilitarization of the police?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much. In addition, so as far as like funding goes, would you support increasing, leveling, decreasing, or eliminating funding for the police?
I've been doing a lot of research and reading up on it, and right now I definitely think the direction things need to go is towards the decreasing the budget and allocating that money. When somebody's in a situation where they are having a crisis, a mental health crisis, I don't think that the police are the best people to be responding in those situations where there aren't guns present and somebody's having a crisis. So in that respect, I would advocate for shifting that money, instead of spending it on policing, spending it on mental health care specialists who are trained in de-escalation. And there are programs like that. There's a program in Eugene, Oregon called Cahoots, and they have a program where people call like 24,000 calls a year, which would have been like 20% of police calls. And there's only been 1% of the time where they have actually had to call for police backup. So it says that in those situations, police are not necessary, and that mental health specialists would be better prepared for those situations. So I would advocate for, at the state level, that's not, so much of what maybe I could focus on, but in general, that's where I'd like to see the trend going.
Definitely. So the next one is a hypothetical. It's a little intense, but let's say a police officer in your jurisdiction has been filmed killing someone that they've stopped or arrested. What would your response be?
Well, I think would be charging that officer, when it's clear that they murdered somebody and it's on camera, that they should be charged with murder. Or you mean, would it be more like, I think an independent investigation, would definitely be warranted. But personally, when something is documented like that, I believe that they should be held accountable and prosecuted.
Definitely. And then if you have any other prepositions you'd like to speak about in terms of what you want to do with policing, now would be the time to talk about them.
Yeah, I think, I'm a strong advocate just for like the decriminalization, like I said, of drugs, and of people experiencing mental health breakdowns. I did a tour of the Dane County Jail 2 years ago, and there was a woman who had thrown a brick through a window and was in jail all weekend because she had thrown a brick through the window. And there wasn't, when the police arrested her, there wasn't any space available to take her to Journey or somewhere for mental health care. And so a lot of times, because there's not enough funding and access to people getting the mental health treatment that they need, they end up being criminalized and taken to the jail instead. And so I would strongly advocate for increasing funding for mental health and shifting those funds so people aren't in those predicaments or where they're taken up to Winnebago in a very traumatizing situation where they're in chains and they're transported and driven a couple hours north. And instead, we need to have more funding everywhere around the state for mental health so people can get treated and get the care that they need.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right, so switching gears, who did you support in the Democratic presidential primary this year and why? And when did you start publicly supporting them?
I was a supporter of Elizabeth Warren for president, and I started supporting her last August. I got a yard sign and had it out, and I ended up organizing a canvas from my house and trained people to knock doors. And I was also phone banking for her campaign and making phone calls to voters, because I really liked her platform of having really big structural change and advocating for healthcare for everybody and fighting racial disparities and working on all the different progressive legislation that she was advocating for around environmental issues and climate change and gun violence prevention. So I felt like I really aligned with her platform.
Thank you. Next one. What is your analysis of the Rivers administration and the legislature's handling of the COVID-19 crisis in Wisconsin, including their handling of the processes leading up to the April 7th election?
Yeah, well, I think that Governor Evers, has really, I think he's done a great job in a really difficult environment because he wanted to delay the election and not subject people to the situation of having to risk their health to exercise their right to vote. But the Republican leaders in the legislature had a different opinion and challenged his decision. And so I supported the decision to not put people in that danger. And I think that's something, as a state legislator, I would come into that sort of environment too, where you're dealing with very opposite opinions. And I think it's going to be a constant dance around staying true to what you believe in, but also trying to find compromise. And so I think that Governor Evers has been doing a good job pushing for the safety of all Wisconsinites. But there's, I think there's just a lack of care from the Republican leaders about what's best for Wisconsinites. And so that's what we're running up against, where if they're more concerned about special interests than they are about Wisconsinites, it's hard to compromise in those situations. So I think that he's doing a good job of doing the best that he can in a difficult environment.
Thank you. Again, changing topics. Are you supportive of the BDS boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement?
Yeah, that's something that I don't think, I'm not an expert in Middle East politics, and that's something that I think I'm not quite sure how to answer, because I've done some research on it, and I know there was a question about protesting, and I absolutely agree with like nonviolent protest and people's right to protest, but I don't know what the right solution is in a really complicated situation. So I'm not exactly sure if I have, I don't have a fully formed stance on that.
Great, thank you.
And then just sort of more broad, so do you believe that protesting is a form of speech, and for the right to do so, including BDS and anti-pipeline movements, should not be punished?
Yes, I agree that I agree with the right to protest, and I did not agree with the legislation that made it a felony to protest pipelines. I think that what happened at Standing Rock was a tragedy that I think that people should have respected the treaty and the right to protect water. And so I don't agree with the legislation that was passed making it a felony.
Thank you.
So these next couple of questions are about like your campaign and the structure of it. So first off, list unions that have already endorsed you in this race, and which labor endorsements are you seeking?
Yeah, I haven't gotten confirmation. I think a lot of the unions haven't weighed in yet on endorsements. So I have applied for AFL-CIO endorsement and the MPI endorsement, but haven't heard back yet. And I did, for organizational endorsements, I did receive Run for Something, which is a national organization focused on electing progressive leaders who are 40 years old or younger. So the idea is building the bench for the future. And I did receive that endorsement. And I also received the Gun Sense candidate distinction through Moms Demand Action. And that's because of my support of common sense gun reform. But other than that, yeah, as far as I know, there hasn't been any other decisions made, particularly in my race, around the union endorsements. Yeah, was there a part to the question? Yeah.
All right, so the next one, it's a little bit intense. I'm going to put it in the chat just to make sure everything's down. This is a question where you can tell that this started out as just a written questionnaire. But regarding fundraising, I'm just going to ask them all at once. How much have you raised for this race to date? Who are your top 3 donors? What percentage of your total is from these top donors? And how much is strictly from small individual donors of roughly less than $50? And if this isn't your first election, which I believe it isn't, please answer this question regarding the last question also.
Yeah, so regarding fundraising, I've raised about $17,500 so far, and my top 3 donors have been people working on environmental issues in the environmental field, who are advocates around clean energy or environmental issues within the state. And then the percentage of my total, I was looking in, so the top donors, anybody who gave over $150, there were 15 or 16 donations that were above $150. And over half of my donations were from people who donated $50 or less. So it was about 130 donations were $50 or less. And I've received about 230 something or so donations. So over half have been $50 or less. And then for my last election, I think it was even more so, even more $50 or less donations. I ran for county board in 2018. And other than just like maybe 3 or 4 donations, they were all around $50 or around that range, $50 or less. So my average donation has been around $70 right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome.
Next, do you support the legalization of recreational cannabis, including the expungement of all previous cannabis-related charges and the release of all those currently serving time for those charges?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Yeah, and I do, and I believe that, yeah, with the expanding our expungement laws, I think is really necessary because it really holds people back from opportunities for people who have been incarcerated. And I think personally, I've advocated for legalization since I was in college. I was an opinion writer 20 years ago, and I wrote an article about the war on drugs and about racial bias and how I believe that we should be handling, if somebody has an issue with drugs, first it should be legalized. I don't think it's anybody's business if they're doing drugs. And then I think, if it's causing problems instead of in the community, that it should be handled in a way that's more rehabilitation rather than criminalization.
Thank you. And then final question here. Do you have any paid staff or consultants working in your campaign? And if so, what percentage of your campaign funding goes to those paid staff?
Yeah, I have one paid staff member for a campaign manager, and then it's a couple who are consulting to help with the video. And so that's about 10% of my budget, or of how much money I've raised so far.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and talking with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah, awesome.